Welcome to Flourishment, the podcast on living life as you are meant to, so you can flourish. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have with me Kristen Hogrefe Parnell. She's an award-winning author and lifelong learner who writes suspenseful fiction from a faith perspective for teens and adults. And she's here to talk to us today about running with God's plan. Welcome, Kristen. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you, Tina. It is so good just to be here and have the chance to chat with you.
I have been connected with you through writers' conferences for many years, and I've read some of your books, but I did not know the details of the story that you shared with me that you're planning to share with listeners today. Can you start us with talking about what it means to you to run with God's plan from your experience of overcoming?
Yeah, so this is both a literal and I guess you could say a figurative challenge for me personally. And I don't think it's one that is just exclusive to me. So running with God's plan, the literal story I shared with you is that I wasn't a runner at all. In college, I actually got exempt from PE on account of a curvy back of mine, and I never thought I'd run. I was happy to take choir instead of PE. But after I graduated, my twin brother, he's very blunt and I love him for it. He said, "You know what? You're not going to get this post-college 15 pounds or whatever." He's like, "You're going to learn to run and work out with me and we're going to have fun doing this." And so lots of shin splints and back spasms later, I did eventually actually strengthen my back enough to run, and eventually went on to do a half marathon, which was just truly evidence of just God's grace in my life, because I didn't think I'd ever be able to even run a mile. And so that's just a kind of a tangible picture for me of the way, almost like a metaphor or analogy of the way God works in my own life, in other ways. My plan might be one thing, but God's plan might be something else. And I feel like he's constantly directing and redirecting as he sees best. And I just need to be willing to run with it.
That is a wonderful, tangible analogy for where a lot of us feel we're just not able, we can't make it. And then God meets us and helps us through the hard places of strengthening and growing into a new way of journeying with him that's more exciting and more powerful and more impactful than we ever imagined.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about this in terms of more personal things. You had that tangible experience. Was that before or after you started to see God moving in other areas of your life to fulfill this in deeper ways than just physical means?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I can look back over different benchmarks in my young life of ways God has gotten my attention. I know, like when I was 15 or 16, I got in a really bad car wreck that wasn't my fault. And it was a really tough situation. And I didn't even understand why that had to happen, except that God wanted my attention. He wanted my loyalty and my faith and trust in him, regardless of the struggles. And I've just continued to see that as an adult, whether it's in my writing journey, which has been a convoluted path at times, yet he has always closed doors as he saw fit, and then opened other opportunities that I didn't even expect. Or even in my personal life, I think I shared with you earlier that I met my husband in my early 30s, and I was expecting to be married in my 20s. So God just he has this way of taking our expectations and asking us, okay, do you trust me? Do you trust that my story for your life is better than what you had planned? And the answer is yes. His way is always better, but that doesn't mean it's always easy.
So, what were some other ways that God said, this was your expectation? Will you allow me to show you something beyond your expectation? You said something about this having to do with your writing journey. I think
Mm,
people that are early in their stages of writing, or people who have not ever been exposed to that journey of writing and may have other areas of ministry that God intends to use that individual as a vessel to provide ministry to others, they may not realize that what they expect to see is not really what's going to happen.
hmm.
And our disappointments can sometimes make us quit.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's such a good point, especially for any creative who is listening or anyone who is, feeling God's tug on their life to pursue a passion or a pursuit for Him, for serving Him. And I think we have to be willing to go into the opportunities that He presents to us with open hands. You know, I love the verse in Proverbs that says, man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. And I just think that's so important because it's good for us to make plans. God wants us to use the abilities and gifts He's given us, but on the other hand, we also have to be willing for Him to redirect or to maybe move in different ways than we would have expected. So whenever I go to, whether it's a conference or just some other opportunity, just to be like, okay, God, I kind of lay it before Him. I'm like, this is how I feel. You've led me and how I see you possibly working, but I'm giving this opportunity to you because He may very well open up a wonderful opportunity, or maybe He'll just plant seeds, for future, or turn us and redirect us to go get some more training before we can actually move forward. So I think for just writers or creatives in general, just having that open hand kind of philosophy that, is willing to let God work, that's something I know that I've had to go back to my quiet time and be like, okay, God, this didn't go like I thought it was going to, but I know you're good and I know you have good plans. And I think that's the key takeaway for us to always remember.
So, when you started on this writing journey, your first manuscript was not immediately a best selling book.
Right. And actually, I actually self-published my first trilogy just because I was so new and I didn't know anything. And I just embarked on that journey even before I'd gone to a conference. Wouldn't necessarily recommend people do it that way, but I always tell people I'm a very hands-on learner and I learn by doing. So that was the first stage of my writing journey. And then I went to a conference and I'm like, oh, wow, look at all of these people and resources that I didn't even know existed. And so that's where I eventually got connected with my current publisher. And even later, then with my agent and the publisher for my future books. So it definitely was, it wasn't an instant, like you said, instant bestseller or instant success story. It's really just been a journey of learning, sometimes by trial and error, what works and what doesn't work, and then just continuing to move forward with the next right thing that I feel that God has called me to do.
So, when you started and your book was not immediately a bestseller, and I think people new to any kind of calling, whether it's writing or ministry or business or any endeavor, you have an expectation when you first do that initial, I'm following God's plan, you think it's all going to work out. And
Mm-hmm.
then you get hit with disappointment. When you were first hit with a disappointment, let's talk about that experience so people can connect with maybe where they might be right now or where they've recently been, so they know what that feels like is not
Mm,
unusual, to
sure.
feel that disappointment. And I'm going to guess that you didn't have that open handed approach your entire life. You had to learn that from having a disappointment experience, right?
Yeah, I don't think anyone is born with an open-handed approach. That's just God's grace and, His his word at work in your life, that does take time. And I'd like to say it's one of those tests in life that you just pass and you move on to the next level, but that's not true either. It's sometimes a daily struggle, or, God, I really want this. Why are you saying no? And for anyone dealing with discouragement, I would just encourage you to stay, first of all, close to God. Be honest, be open with him how you are feeling discouraged. We see King David did that so often in the Psalms. He'd cry out to God, but then God would always remind him of the truth. We'd see him closing so many of his Psalms with praise. And for the person who feels that they've messed up, or they're too big of a failure, I would say, what, failures are often the stepping stones to success, and the only true failure is when you quit. So if you don't quit and you move forward and you learn from that experience and just have that teachable attitude, you may never know what doors will be open in the future that may not be open today, but you just have to keep moving forward. So I would just say all of that to say, if I had quit because somebody turned me down, or because, I wasn't an overnight New York Times bestselling author, I wouldn't be writing today, and I wouldn't be hearing from readers who are telling me my books challenge and encourage them. So there are different definitions for success. Knowing that I'm doing what God wants me to do and that my books are having an impact on lives, like, that's huge.
That is God's definition of success, is obedience. And we get
Mm-hmm.
over those things that the world tells us are necessary to call ourselves successful, don't we?
Right.
I want to unpack a little bit what you just said about failures being stepping stones to success. That is totally contrary to the world's definition of success for the
Mm-hmm.
most part. We expect to build success, not upon a failure. So, what are some examples in your history of times when you failed that helped you succeed better?
Ooh, such a good question. I mean, I've definitely made my shares of mistakes, even like I was saying earlier with self-publishing, learning the do's and the don'ts, learning how much effort really goes into presenting a final manuscript. I know I definitely spent hours, on edits, and hours on cover design and art, many of which did not turn out well. So in the writing world, I mean, it's just there's a lot of successes and failures along the way. I mean, even at writing conferences where we've met in the past, you'll submit maybe half a dozen submissions for a contest, and I can say, like, at one conference I would come in first place, at the next conference I wouldn't even place at all. And so, taking both the success and the failure kind of with a grain of salt. When you do get that success, being grateful, and also humble, because you may very well not even place in the next contest. So not resting on the laurels, but also not dwelling on the failure. I think those are just some really important practices that we can have, regardless of whether we're writers or, teachers, or in some other capacity serving others.
Did you see this in your teaching experience as well?
Yes. And with teaching, it's me constantly encouraging my students that it's okay to fail. I'll get so many messages if I leave, I always leave feedback, whether it's positive or constructive, on their projects and assignments. And so often they will say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I can't believe I made that mistake. Just I'm so embarrassed." And I'll reply, "It's okay. We learn from our mistakes. If we never made a mistake, we would never know how to avoid it in the future." So I feel, as a teacher, it's so important to extend that grace and give students the room to fail, and let them know it's a safe place to fail. And I feel like that's what God does with us. He's like, "I'm a safe place. Yes, you're going to make mistakes, and yes, you're going to have disappointments, but I'm a safe place, and it's okay. You can learn and keep going." So, yeah, I would say that's definitely been an interesting perspective of me being on the other side of that relationship as a teacher.
And that's an interesting way of putting it, that we can have a safe place in our relationship with God to fail,
Mhm.
because that's a terrifying thing to consider. You might fail God, isn't it?
Mm. Oh, wow. Yeah, for sure. And I think it's also helpful just to go back to his word and study, all the characters in the Bible. So many of them had giant failures. And just to see, God's still hand in working together all things for good. I think one of my favorite stories is Joseph. He had these grandiose dreams as a teenager that his family was going to bow down, and then pretty much the next, oh, I don't know, 17 or so years of his life were one failure after the next. His brothers sold him into slavery. He gets falsely accused and thrown into prison. He must have felt like the biggest failure ever. And yet God was using those really deep, dark moments of his life to prepare him for something he couldn't even see. And his story has always been an encouragement to me that when life is not going as planned, God still has a plan, and we can run with it and trust him for it.
What would you say to those who are in that place of discouragement right now, where they're not seeing the Pharaoh moment, they're seeing the imprisonment stage, where they are stuck, there's no hope, they don't see anything other than what they're in right now, being in their future, and they feel as though they are hopeless in a pit of utter despair and failure? What would you say to someone who's in that place, to offer them the hope that they have a plan in God's kingdom that they can run with?
Mm. I mean, first of all, God says he'll never leave us or forsake us. So no matter how hopeless the situation looks, we can know the truth that he is still present with us in that place. And I understand the struggle, the disconnect sometimes between what we know in our minds and what we feel. Like those can be very, very different. And so I think I read somewhere that it's helpful to keep reminding ourselves of the truth until our emotions catch up with it. So, if they're in a dark place, or, they're just feeling hopeless, I would say, first of all, don't isolate, go talk to somebody, go, sometimes, just your quiet time, that's absolutely important, but you need a voice to speak truth to your life. And I know, and sometimes I've gone to my friends and I said, hey, I know in my head what the truth is, but I need to hear it from you. I need to hear it from someone else. So, go find a godly friend or a godly mentor or family member who can speak that truth back to your life, because sometimes we just need to hear it from someone else.
So, if you are willing to step out of that place of despair and discouragement and move forward, but you're struggling with understanding exactly what the direction is, the title of the podcast is Running with God's Plan. Sometimes it's difficult to discern what God's plan is. Can you speak to that a little bit? I know in the writing journey and often in a teaching role, it's difficult to know what the right next best thing is to do.
Yes, and that is a question I have asked. And I'll never forget when I was in college, I had many godly faculty speaking into my life, but one teacher in particular, I was asking her, I said, how do I know what God's will is for my life? And I was really stressed about it. I was getting ready to graduate and I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do. And she said, Kristen, God is not going to send you on a giant Easter egg hunt and tell you, "Oh, well, you didn't find it. That really stinks. You missed out." She said, "No, he's not that kind of God. He is wanting you to do and to know his will for your life." And she said, "There isn't just necessarily one right choice. Obviously the Bible gives us very clear guidelines for what is sin or what is righteousness as far as our life choices go. But as far as whether we should take this job over another job or sign with this publisher instead of another publisher, that's not necessarily a right or a wrong decision. And so it just really, that conversation with her really stuck with me because it's helped me know that if the choices I'm facing aren't wrong, then God can work through any of them and continue to use me regardless of, which position I take or which publisher I sign with or any other number of scenarios. So obviously it's always a good idea to consult godly mentors and people who are farther along on this race of life than I am. But at the end of the day, again, kind of taking it to God, asking him for peace and direction. And sometimes you just have to move forward with the next right thing and trust that he's going to illuminate your path for the next right thing after that.
Let's talk about that analogy of running too for just a minute, because sometimes we want to run when we should walk, and sometimes we want to walk when we should run. And in the context of knowing what God's will is, sometimes that timing and pacing piece is important to how God is developing us. Have you had periods where you had to either slow down or speed up in accordance with what God's will was? And how did you come to those realizations?
Oh, wow. That's such a timely question. So, another very tangible example comes to mind. So, as a runner, I mean, I haven't run a half marathon in a few years, but I do have a weekly practice of running just to maintain a general level of fitness. And so my husband and I were on a ski trip this last winter, and I was being very careful, but the conditions were incredibly icy. And I actually ended up falling, a really bad crash, and dislocating my shoulder. So much so that I couldn't do the most basic things that we take for granted every day, let alone run. And my neighbors all know me as the girl who runs. And I was literally out there with my arm in a sling, just walking my running route. And I couldn't run. It was far too painful. My shoulder needed time to heal. So all I could do was walk. All I could do was just, put one foot in front of another and take a lot of pain medication. And I think that really parallels our spiritual lives and also just other areas of our lives. Sometimes we can't do anything but just walk, like you were saying. Sometimes God slows us down to get our attention, to remind us how much we need to depend on him, or just to, remind us and turn us to him in prayer, or just out of sheer dependency. I was so dependent on my husband for everything from cooking to laundry to washing my hair. It was a truly humbling experience. And I just feel that's such a parallel. God taught me so much about himself, reminded me how much I need him and need the people he's placed in my life. And so, to anyone who feels like, man, I'm in a place I can't run, I have to just walk, I just have to put one foot in front of the next, that's okay. That's okay too. And maybe that's right where you need to be today.
What about for those people who have been walking and have slowed down so much that they've gotten in that place of discouragement and they need to get back started walking again and running again? How do you get over that rut of being still and back into moving forward with God's plan?
Yeah, and that's where you have to put yourself out there and be vulnerable. It wasn't pretty when I started running again after my shoulder. It wasn't pretty at all. I think my mile was like 11:30 when it's usually like maybe 9:30 or 10. I just had to do it. And so if you're in a place where you feel like you're kind of in a rut, everybody's different, whether you're a planner or you like to have a calendar, but start putting things on your calendar. Start mapping out baby benchmarks. Okay, I'm going to do this today. It may not be pretty, it might not work out well, but I'm going to write just one blog, or I'm going to, query 5 publishers this week, or I'm going to pursue pursue that article or whatever it is. I'm kind of talking in the field of writing because that's what I relate to. But for anyone listening, you know what those first steps are that you need to do to get to what you would like to do. So tackle, I think someone once said, the low hanging fruit, the things that are easily within your grasp, and just start doing them. And then wait and see what the results are and keep pressing forward. So I would say it really starts with those small daily decisions to, be disciplined and to move forward with the little things that are going to help get you to where you want to go.
That's great advice. Do you have any other final parting tips for the audience about running with God's plan?
I would just encourage, anyone who's listening that God's plan is always going to be better for you than what you perhaps thought it would be. But again, just remember, it's not always going to be easy. God often calls us to wait on him. And I don't know if y'all are like me, but I am not a good waiter. I can be very impatient at times. And, even now there's things God's put on my heart that he's saying, no, you got to wait. And I don't understand why. You might not understand why either. But we know we serve a God who is good and who does good things and has a beautiful plan for each of our lives, even through suffering, even through disappointments. And so that would just be my takeaway for anyone listening. Don't give up, whether you have to walk or whether you're ready to start running. Just make sure you're running with God, because his journey, his plan for your life is going to be the best one that you can choose.
That is beautifully said. And so are all the things in your novels. And I want to make sure that listeners have an opportunity to connect with you and get their hands on your amazing fiction. So let's talk about that for a moment. How can people connect with you and get their hands on your wonderfully written, award-winning books?
Well, thank you. And yes, they can connect with me on my website. And I know my website name is a mouthful because it is my name, my maiden name merged with my married name. So Kristen Hogrefe Parnell.com. And I would just recommend going to the show notes because me trying to spell it gets a little bit confusing. But I have a newsletter there. And if anyone wants to sign up, they can actually receive my free novella, which is a prequel to the first novel, The Revisionary, in my young adult dystopian trilogy. And so that'll give them a taste for my writing and if that kind of story is right for them.
I actually really enjoyed reading your novels, so I can recommend that personally to those who are listening. I appreciate you coming on Flourishment today. I hope that all of you listening will connect with Kristen and, of course, come back for the next episode of Flourishment.